My name is Isaiah Reed. I am 72 years old, and for 40 of those years I drove the steel snakes that slither beneath New York City. I thought I knew every secret the tunnels held, every ghost that haunted the tracks. But the darkest secret, the most venomous betrayal, was standing right behind me on the platform. My own family. They pushed me in front of a speeding train and smiled as it roared over my body. They thought it was over. They thought they had won. But for me, it was just the beginning. Before I tell you how I survived and turned their world into a living nightmare, let me know in the comments where you're listening to my story from. And please hit that like and subscribe button if you believe that sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. The smell of morning coffee used to be the most peaceful part of my day. Now it was thick with a tense, cloying silence. I sat at the old oak table, the same one where my wife Gloria and I had shared a lifetime of coffee and plans. Now across from me sat my son-in-law Preston, wearing a smile so confident it was insulting. My daughter Alicia stood behind him, a ghost in her own home, twisting her hands together as if trying to wring the weakness out of them. Preston started his voice as smooth as honey poured over something rotten. Pops Isaiah, he began pushing a stack of envelopes across the table towards me. The little plastic windows on them showed angry red warnings. We've hit a bit of a snag again. I promise this is the last time. He used the word we, a clever little word. We meant I paid the bills while they lived the life. I glanced at Alicia. She avoided my eyes, her gaze fixed on a small crack in the linoleum floor, a crack I'd been meaning to fix for a week. She always found something inanimate to focus on when reality became too much to bear. "Just this once, Daddy," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. I picked up the top letter, a credit card bill. The final balance made my stomach clench. It was more than my entire month's pension. I scanned the list of charges, my eyes glazing over the names. A dinner at a restaurant I couldn't even pronounce. A handbag from a store on Fifth Avenue. Weekend concert tickets. Their life was a non-stop party, and I was the janitor who came in the next morning to clean up the mess. I looked into my daughter's eyes, searching for a flicker of my Gloria in them. But there was nothing. My Gloria was a fighter. She grew up in Bed-Stuy in the 60s. She knew the value of a dollar earned through hard work. She taught both of us that respect isn't about what you own, it's about how you earn it. Gloria always used to say, "Isaiah, don't ever let anyone mistake your kindness for weakness. I guess I failed you, my love." I remembered the day Alicia brought Preston home. He wore an expensive suit, shook my hand with a grip that was a little too firm, and promised me he would take care of my little girl, that she would never have to worry about a thing. It turned out that a thing included paying her own bills. His promises were now as cheap and flimsy as these pieces of paper. "All right," I said, my voice flat, betraying none of the storm brewing inside me. "It's a trick you learn in the tunnels. Panic doesn't stop the train. I'll pay it." Preston let out a soft sigh of relief, his smile widening. "I knew you'd understand, Pops. You've always been the rock of this family." But I added, cutting him off, "I want to see the detailed statements for all the cards, for the last 6 months. The smile on Preston's face froze at the edges. He shot a quick glance at Alicia, but she was still deep in her study of the floor. "Of course, Pops, no problem at all. I'll print them out and get them to you later." "Don't bother," I said. "I don't want to trouble you. I'll go to the bank myself tomorrow morning." The silence that fell over the kitchen was different this time. It wasn't tense anymore. It was cold. I could hear the loud tick-tock of the old clock on the wall, a wedding gift from decades ago. Each tick sounded like a warning. Preston forced a laugh, but his eyes had changed. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating look. He knew I wasn't just asking about numbers anymore. I was starting to question everything, and that was something he could not afford. "Whatever you say," he said, shrugging with a casualness he didn't feel. But I knew. The silent war had just been declared. The bank the next morning felt cold and sterile. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, reflecting off the polished marble floors, making everything look artificially clean. I told the young teller a small lie to uncover a much larger one. I said I'd misplaced my credit card and needed a full, itemized statement of all supplementary accounts to check for fraudulent activity. The irony was bitter on my tongue. The fraud was sitting at my kitchen table. The young woman nodded sympathetically, and after a few moments of quiet typing the printer behind her whirred to life. It spit out page after page. When she finally placed the thick stack of paper neatly stapled on the counter in front of me, I knew my gut feeling hadn't been wrong. It had been an understatement. I found an empty chair in the corner of the lobby and began to read. The first page was bad enough, the charges I'd already seen on the bill. But as I turned to the second page and then the third, a wave of nausea rose in my throat. It wasn't just expensive dinners and designer clothes. There were charges for boutique hotels in the Hamptons on weekends. They told me they were working hard. Receipts from jewelry stores for pieces I'd never seen Alicia wear. My money wasn't just supporting their life, it was funding a secret life I wasn't even aware of. But that wasn't the worst of it. As I sifted through the statement from 3 months prior, one line item made me stop breathing. Cash advance. $20,000. $20,000. The number swam before my eyes. My mind flashed back to the winter of 1998, the year Gloria was diagnosed with her heart condition. The insurance didn't cover the whole procedure. We had to sell our old Ford, a car my own father had left me just to make ends meet. I took every overtime shift I could get driving the train through the dark, cold tunnels while the rest of the city slept, just to make sure the woman I loved would see another spring. We fought for every single one of those dollars. That $20,000 wasn't just money to me. It was blood, sweat, and sleepless nights filled with worry. And they had withdrawn it from my life as easily as pulling a tissue from a box. My hands were trembling. I kept turning the pages mechanically, my mind numb with shock. And then I saw it. A recurring payment every single month. It wasn't a huge amount, just a few $100s, but it was regular like a heartbeat. The recipient, Hayes Solutions, LLC. The name meant nothing to me. Hayes was Preston's last name. But solutions for what? I walked back to the counter, my legs feeling unsteady. I pointed to the line on the paper. "Can you tell me what this company is?" The teller typed for a moment. "According to our records, sir, it's listed as a consulting firm. This transaction is set up as an automatic monthly payment." "Who set it up?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Let me see." The request was made online from the IP address linked to your home account. It was authenticated using your security information. Of course it was. They lived in my house. They had access to everything. I felt like a fool. A blind, sentimental old fool who loved his only daughter too much to see the truth. I had spent my life building a fortress to protect my family, only to hand the keys to the traitors inside. I thanked the teller and walked out of the bank. The cold October air hit my face, but it couldn't extinguish the fire that was now raging in my chest. I wasn't sad anymore. Sadness had been burned away, leaving something harder and colder in its place. Resolve. I was going to find out what Hayes Solutions LLC was, and I was going to make them pay for every single cent. The house was eerily quiet when I got back. Alicia was in the kitchen wiping down a counter that was already spotless. Preston was in the living room pretending to read a business magazine. He looked up as I walked in, that familiar smirk pasted on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. I didn't say a word. I walked straight to the dining table and dropped the thick stack of bank statements onto the wood. The sound of the paper hitting the surface was loud in the silence, as sharp and final as a gunshot. Alicia flinched, dropping a glass into the sink with a clatter. Preston lowered his magazine, his face a mask of wary caution. "What is Hayes Solutions LLC?" I asked. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a locomotive. For a split second, I saw a flicker of panic in Preston's eyes before he buried it under a layer of arrogance. "Ah," that he said, standing up and walking towards me, trying for a casual air with his hands stuffed in his pockets. "That's my real estate company, a little side venture. I'm using the money to invest in our future. Our future." I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. By draining my life savings without telling me I was going to tell you, he lied, the words sliding off his tongue with practiced ease. I was just waiting for the right moment when the investment started paying off. I wanted to surprise you. "Oh, I'm surprised, all right," I said. "I'm surprised about the $20,000 cash advance. Was that an investment too?" This time even Preston couldn't come up with a lie fast enough. He fell silent. Alicia emerged from the kitchen, her eyes red and puffy. "Daddy," she started, her voice trembling. "Preston needed the capital for a big deal. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." "Don't you trust my husband?" Those words. They hurt more than any of the numbers on the pages. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, was standing there defending the man who was bleeding me dry. She had chosen her side. "This isn't about trust, Alicia," I said, and my voice had turned to ice. "It's about respect, something neither of you seems to have. You live in the house your mother and I sweat to build. You spend the money I saved for my old age, and you don't even have the decency to tell me the truth." A smirk played on Preston's lips, a real one this time. It was naked, unapologetic contempt. "Come on, Pops, you're old. You don't need all that money anymore. Just think of it as your investment in your own retirement. We'll take care of you." He said the words, "take care of you," like he was talking about a bothersome pet or a piece of old furniture that needed to be dusted off once in a while. In that moment, I saw him for what he truly was, a predator, and I had been his prey. He saw my sacrifices not as love, but as weakness to be exploited. That was it. That was the end. "Things are going to change," I stated, looking him dead in the eye. The fire in my chest had turned to glaciers. "Starting tomorrow, I am canceling all supplementary cards. Every single expense down to the last dollar will be approved by me. Period." The air in the room grew thick enough to choke on. Alicia finally broke down, letting out a series of pathetic, weak sobs. "Daddy, you can't. How will we live?" I didn't answer her. My eyes were locked on Preston. He said nothing. The smirk was gone. His face was a blank canvas, but his eyes were not. In his pale blue eyes, I saw something dark and dangerous stir. It was the look of a cornered animal, one that would do anything to get out. That look told me everything I needed to know. I hadn't just cut off his supply of money. I had just signed my own death warrant. He wasn't going to let this go. I knew it, and he knew that I knew. The confrontation was over, but the real war was just about to begin. 2 days passed in a cold, heavy silence. Then, just as I was beginning to think they had accepted their new reality, Preston approached me. He had the expression of a saint on his face, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Alicia hovered behind him, wearing a smile so forced it looked painful. "Pops," Isaiah Preston said, his voice oozing with false sincerity. "Alicia and I have been talking. You were right. We've been disrespectful and we're sorry. Truly. Let's put all this behind us. Let me take you out to dinner tonight, a nice place in Manhattan. My treat." I stared at him, saying nothing. His treat. With what money? But I simply nodded. Alicia's forced smile wavered with relief. "Great," Preston beamed. "And hey, for old time's sake, let's take the 7 train. You can tell us some of your old stories." The words hung in the air, a thinly veiled mockery of the life I had lived. They never wanted to hear my stories. They always took an Uber, complaining about the crowds and the noise of the subway. I knew this wasn't an olive branch. It was something else. But I agreed. To refuse would be to show my hand. I had to see what their game was. The walk to the 74th Street station was surreal. Preston chattered on about some meaningless deal he was supposedly closing while Alicia walked beside me in almost total silence. The air was thick with things unsaid. When we descended the steps into the station, the familiar roar and rush of the city's metal veins hit me. The platform was packed, a river of humanity flowing in both directions during the evening rush. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal and stale pretzels. "It's too crowded here," Preston shouted over the noise, placing a hand on the small of my back. It might have seemed like a respectful gesture to a stranger, but to me, it felt like a cattle prod guiding me. He steered me away from the relative safety of the station walls towards the edge of the platform, towards the yellow warning line. Alicia took my other arm. "Be careful, Daddy," she said, her voice tight. Her grip was surprisingly firm, her hand cold as marble even through my jacket sleeve. It wasn't a gesture of care. It was an anchor. They had me pinned between them. My 40 years of experience screamed at me. Every instinct honed in the darkness of the tunnels was on high alert. You don't stand this close to the edge, not during rush hour. Not ever. I could feel the slight vibration of the concrete as trains passed on other levels. I could see the grime on the tracks below the glint of discarded cans and the shadows where the rats lived. This was a place of danger, a place where one wrong step, one careless shove was all it took. Preston leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear, his voice a low poison meant only for me over the din of the station. "You know, Pops," he said softly, "that house in Queens, it's worth a lot of money, enough to give a man a fresh start." A deep rumble started in the tunnel, a vibration I could feel in the soles of my shoes. A single bright light cut through the darkness, growing larger, faster. The monster was coming. The light grew from a pinprick to a blinding sun. The rumble became a physical force, a vibration that traveled from the tracks through the concrete and into my bones. And in that moment, as the roar of the approaching train filled the world, the hand on my back went from a guide to a weapon. It wasn't a stumble. It wasn't an accidental jostle in the crowd. It was a firm, deliberate push, a violent shove with the full weight of Preston's body behind it. There was no ambiguity. It was a sentence delivered in silence. In the same split second, Alicia's grip on my arm vanished. Her hand didn't just let go. It was pulled away, a final act of severing our bond. My daughter, my little girl, released me to my death. The world tilted on its axis. For a fraction of a second, there was only air beneath my feet. I saw the shocked faces of strangers in the crowd turning towards me, their mouths opening in silent screams. I saw the grimy, oil-stained tracks rushing up to meet me. The bright, unforgiving light of the train was the last thing I saw before I hit the gravel bed between the rails. The impact knocked the wind out of me. The sharp edges of the ballast stones dug into my back and skull, but there was no time for pain. There was no time for fear. Panic is a luxury for those with time to spare. Down here you have seconds. In that moment of pure, terrifying clarity, my body remembered what my mind was still trying to process. 40 years of working in these tunnels, 40 years of safety, briefings of hearing horror stories, of knowing the anatomy of this beast from the inside out. It all took over. Time didn't slow down. It became sharp. Every microsecond was a decision. I knew something the tourists on the platform didn't. I knew about the drainage trough, a shallow, greasy ditch running down the center of the track bed just deep enough to offer a sliver of life. It wasn't a choice. It was an instinct. With a grunt, I rolled onto my stomach, ignoring the searing pain in my ribs. I scrambled, clawing at the gravel, pulling my body into that shallow depression. I pressed my face into the dirt and grime, the smell of decay and electricity filling my nostrils. I flattened myself, trying to make myself one with the ground, tucking my chin to my chest, my arms clamped tight to my sides. I became as small and insignificant as the rats that called this place home. And then the world ended. The roar of the train was no longer a sound. It was a physical presence, a crushing weight of noise and wind that pressed down on me, trying to tear me apart. The first car screamed over my head, a hurricane of hot, displaced air. The noise was indescribable, a deafening shriek of metal on metal so loud it felt like my skull would crack open. Inches from my back, thousands of tons of steel hurtled by at 50 miles an hour. I could feel the heat radiating from the undercarriage. I could smell the hot oil and the sharp metallic tang of brake dust. Sparks rained down around me, tiny fleeting stars in my dark, violent universe. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, but I could see the flashing lights of the undercarriage through my eyelids. I didn't dare to breathe. It felt like the train was sucking all the oxygen out of the air, leaving me in a vacuum of terror. I could feel the ground vibrating so intensely it was like being held in the fist of an angry god. Each set of wheels that passed over was a separate explosion of sound, a fresh wave of terror. Car after car after car. It felt like an eternity. I was no longer a man. I was just a collection of nerves, a consciousness trapped in a coffin of moving steel, waiting for the one stray piece of metal, the one hanging chain that would end it all. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The last car whipped past, and the soul-crushing noise was replaced by a silence so profound it was painful. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine, the ghost of the train's scream. For a long moment, I just lay there, my face pressed into the filth, feeling the last of the vibrations fade from the ground beneath me. I was alive. Then the chaos erupted on the platform above. It was a distant sound, at first muffled, but it quickly grew into a symphony of panic. I could hear screams, not of terror, but of shock. Shouts of, "Oh my God, and did you see that?" The frantic sound of running feet on the concrete, the collective gasp of a crowd that had just witnessed what they thought was a man being obliterated. Their panic was a storm raging on a faraway coast. Down here in the grime and the shadows, there was a strange, cold calm. A deep groan escaped my lips as I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees. My body screamed in protest. Every rib felt bruised, every muscle ached from the impact and the tension. The sharp gravel had cut into my palms, but my will was colder and harder than the steel rails beside me. I slowly, deliberately got to my feet. I looked up at the platform. My eyes scanned past the horrified faces of strangers, past the transit workers who were already rushing towards the scene. I was looking for only two people, and I found them. They were standing exactly where I had left them near the edge, looking down at the tracks. But they weren't screaming. They weren't panicking. They were smiling. It wasn't a smile of joy or happiness. It was the smug, satisfied smile of a predator that has just made a clean kill. It was the look of a problem being solved, of an inheritance being secured. In their eyes, I saw the reflection of their greed, their contempt, their absolute certainty that I was gone. Then they saw me. I saw the exact moment my living, breathing form registered in their minds. Preston's eyes widened, the smugness dissolving like sugar in water. Alicia's hand flew to her mouth, her smile cracking and falling from her face like a broken mask. The color drained from their faces, replaced by a pasty, sickly white. What they saw wasn't a victim. It wasn't a frail old man who had miraculously survived. What they saw was a ghost climbing out of his own grave. Their satisfaction curdled into confusion, then disbelief, and finally into a look of pure, primal terror. It was the raw terror of an animal that has just realized the thing it was hunting is now hunting it. In that dead, silent space between us, with the chaos of the city swirling around us, they understood their mistake. Their mistake wasn't in trying to kill me. Their mistake was in failing. They had thrown me into the darkness, into the one place on earth I knew better than my own home. They thought it was my tomb. They were about to find out it was my kingdom. I ignored the hands of strangers reaching down to help me. I placed my own hands on the edge of the platform and hauled my aching body up from the tracks. I stood before them, covered in dirt and grime, but standing tall. My eyes never left theirs. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The war had begun, and as I calmly brushed the dust from the shoulders of my old coat, they knew with a certainty that would haunt their every waking moment that I was going to be the one to finish it. I didn't go home. To go back to that house in Queens to sleep under the same roof as the two people who had just tried to murder me was unthinkable. It was their territory, their trap. The police were useless to me at this point, a failed attempt with no impartial witnesses. It would be my frantic word against their calm, rehearsed lies. They would paint me as a confused, senile old man who stumbled. No, I couldn't fight them on their terms. I had to fight them on mine. Adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, a fire that burned away the pain and the cold. I walked for blocks until I found a cheap, anonymous hotel, the kind with flickering neon signs and carpets that had seen too many secrets. I paid for a room in cash using the emergency $100 bill Gloria always insisted I keep folded in my wallet. Inside the room, which smelled of stale cigarettes and disinfectant, I locked the door, bolted the chain, and sat on the edge of the lumpy bed. My body was a map of new aches and pains, but my mind was a machine whirring with a cold, clear purpose. I took out my phone. My first call was not to the police. It was to the only person on this earth I still trusted completely. It was to Walter Johnson. Walt and I started at the MTA within 6 months of each other back in the early 80s. We weren't just colleagues. We were brothers forged in the grease and grime of the tunnels. We'd seen blizzards shut down the city, seen riots flicker on the streets above, and seen the transit system change and groan under the weight of the years. He retired a year before I did, but he couldn't stay away. He took a job in the MTA's Central Security and Surveillance Office. He had eyes on the entire system. He was my only move. He picked up on the second ring, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Isaiah. It's past midnight. Everything okay? I'm fine, Walt, I said, and was surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. There was no tremor, no panic, just ice. But I need a favor, a big one, and you can't ask any questions. Not yet. I could hear the concern in the silence on the other end of the line. Name it, he finally said. I need you to pull the security footage from the 74th Street station, the eastbound platform for the 7 train. I need everything from around 8:15 tonight. Isaiah, what the hell happened? Later, Walt. Right now I need the video. Specifically, I need you to find the moment the train pulls out of the station. My daughter and my son-in-law were on the platform. I was on the tracks. The angle might not show how I got there. That's not what I'm looking for. I paused, taking a breath. I'm looking for what they did after the train passed over me. I'm looking for their faces. Find their faces, Walt. Find their smiles. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, thick with shock, and 1,000 unspoken questions. Walt knew me. He knew I wasn't a man given to drama or exaggeration. He knew that for me to make a call like this, something terrible, something unimaginable must have happened. "Give me an hour," he said, his voice now grim and serious. The line went dead. The next hour was the longest of my life. I didn't pace. I didn't watch the ancient television. I just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling paint on the wall, my mind replaying the push, the fall, the roar of the train. But most of all, I replayed their smiles. The image was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I snatched it up. It was Walt. "I have it," he said, and his voice was different. The friendly rumble was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fury. "Jesus Christ, Isaiah. I'm looking at it right now. You're right, the angle on the main camera is partially blocked by a pillar. It doesn't show the push itself, but the platform camera on the far end, it gets them clear as day after the train leaves." He paused, and I heard him take a shaky breath. "They're not screaming for help. They're not running to find a transit worker. They're just standing there. And you were right. They're smiling. That son of a bitch Preston has this little smirk on his face. Alicia. God, Isaiah. She looks relieved." I closed my eyes. Hearing it confirmed by someone else made it real in a way my own memory couldn't. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a fact. "I've made a copy," Walt continued, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Saved it to a secure drive. The original logs will show I accessed the file, but I'll bury it in a system maintenance report. It's yours." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to get justice, Walt," I said. "My way." After I hung up, I stood and looked at my reflection in the cheap, cracked mirror above the dresser. The man looking back at me was a stranger. He was old, covered in dirt, with a new hardness in his eyes. The loving father, the trusting father-in-law had died on those tracks. The man who climbed back onto the platform was someone new, someone colder, someone who now had his first piece of evidence, his first weapon. The video of that smile wasn't just a recording. It was a promise of the nightmare that was to come. Walt's introduction was simple. He gave me a name and an address in Harlem. "Denise Morgan. She's not cheap, and she doesn't suffer fools," he'd said. "But if you want to bring down a building, she's the one who knows exactly where to place the dynamite." The next morning, I took the train uptown. Her office wasn't in a glittering skyscraper downtown. It was on the third floor of a historic brownstone overlooking a street lined with old trees. The plaque by the door was understated, just her name in simple, elegant brass letters. Inside, there was no plush leather or modern art. The room was lined with books. Not just law books, but books on history, economics, and philosophy. The air smelled of old paper and freshly brewed coffee. It was a room built for thinking, not for impressing. Denise Morgan was standing by the window looking out at the street when I was shown in. She was a tall, striking woman in her 50s, with her hair pulled back in a severe but elegant style. She wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit that spoke of quiet authority. She didn't smile when she turned to greet me. She just looked at me with intelligent, assessing eyes that seemed to see right through the grime on my clothes and the exhaustion on my face. "Mr. Reed," she said. Her voice was calm and measured, but it held an undeniable power. "Walter Johnson speaks very highly of you. He said it was a matter of extreme urgency. Please sit." I sat in a firm, no-nonsense chair opposite a large, uncluttered desk. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I took the small silver thumb drive Walt had given me out of my pocket and placed it squarely in the center of her desk. The gesture felt monumental, like placing a single chess piece on the board to begin a game of life and death. 2 nights ago I began, and I told her everything. I told her about the credit cards, the confrontation, the false invitation to dinner. I told her about the push, the fall, the roar of the train. I described it all in the same flat, emotionless tone I had used with Walt. The details were the important part, not my feelings. She listened without interruption, her gaze never leaving my face. Her stillness was unnerving. She wasn't taking notes. She was absorbing every word, every pause, every flicker of emotion I tried to hide. When I finished, I gestured to the thumb drive. My friend at the MTA pulled the security footage. "It's all on there." She picked up the drive, her movements precise and economical. She plugged it into her laptop, and for the next 5 minutes, the only sound in the room was the soft clicking of her keyboard. She watched the footage, then replayed a short segment, and then replayed it again. Her face remained a perfect, unreadable mask. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for a verdict. I had come here hoping for an explosion, for outrage, for a declaration of war. Instead, when she finally looked up, her expression was one of cool, dispassionate analysis. "Mr. Reed," she began, her voice calm, "let me be perfectly clear about what we have here and what we don't. This video is emotionally devastating." She turned the laptop screen towards me, pausing it on the image of Preston and Alicia, their faces illuminated by the platform lights, their smiles clear and cruel. Any jury, any human being with a soul, would look at this and be horrified. It is a powerful portrait of malice. That is its strength. She paused, letting the weight of that sink in before delivering the blow. However, from a legal standpoint, for a criminal case of attempted murder, it is almost useless. The words hit me like a physical punch. Useless. I had thought it was everything. Walt was right. She continued, seeing the disappointment on my face. The angle of the primary camera is obstructed. We do not see a push. We see you on the platform one moment and on the tracks the next. Your son-in-law and daughter will say you stumbled. They will say you fainted. They will invent a dozen plausible reasons for your fall. She turned the screen back towards herself. And their reaction, she said, anticipating my next question. A good defense attorney, and with your money at stake, they will hire the best, will argue that they were in shock, paralyzed by fear, that their smiles were not smiles of satisfaction but grimaces of terror and disbelief. They will say they were frozen, unable to process the horror of what they were seeing. They will cry on the stand. Your daughter will talk about how much she loves her elderly father and how terrified she was. It will be a performance, a disgusting one, but it will be enough to create reasonable doubt. In a criminal court, reasonable doubt is all they need to walk away free. And they will. I felt the hope that had sustained me for the past day begin to drain away, leaving a cold, empty void. The video was my proof, my smoking gun, and she had just told me it was firing blanks. I must have looked as defeated as I felt because her expression softened just slightly. She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. I told you what the video isn't, Mr. Reed. Now let me tell you what it is. It is not a weapon for a criminal court, but it is an exceptional weapon for a different kind of war. It tells me everything I need to know about the character of your opponents. It tells me they are arrogant. It tells me they are reckless. And it tells me they will underestimate you. People like this always do. She held my gaze, and her eyes were like polished steel. Which brings me to the most important question. What do you want? Don't give me a legal answer. Give me a human one. What is the end goal here, Mr. Reed? Do you want revenge, or do you want justice? The question hung in the air between us. Revenge. The word tasted bitter. Revenge was a messy emotional fire that consumed everything, including the person who lit it. It was a punch in the dark, a moment of fleeting satisfaction followed by emptiness. That wasn't what I wanted. I started, my voice raspy. I thought of Gloria. I thought of the life we had built, the principles we lived by. Honesty, hard work, dignity. I want them to face consequences, real ones. I don't want to see them suffer for my own satisfaction. I want to see them lose everything they tried to take from me. I want my house back. I want my money back. I want my good name, the one they used to secure their fraudulent loans, restored. I want them to have to stand on their own 2 feet and discover how hard the world really is without my foundation beneath them. I want to dismantle the life they built on lies brick by brick until there is nothing left but the truth. That's not revenge. I looked her straight in the eye. That's justice. For the first time since I had walked into her office, Denise Morgan smiled. It was a small, thin smile, but it was real. It was the smile of a master craftsman who has just been handed a worthy project. Good, she said, her voice now sharp and energized, because revenge is a fool's game. Justice, on the other hand, is a strategy. We will not fight them in criminal court. We will bleed them dry in civil court. We will not attack them with emotion. We will bury them in paperwork. We will use their own greed and arrogance as a weapon against them. Her entire demeanor had shifted. The calm analyst was gone. In her place was a general outlining a plan of attack. This is what we will do, she said, her voice crisp and clear. First, we forget about the push for now. That is our ace in the hole, a psychological bomb we will detonate when the time is right. Our initial assault will be on their finances. You mentioned a company. Hayes Solutions, LLC. I nodded. Yes. They were taking money from my account every month. That is our entry point, she declared. That is where the arat begins. I am going to find out what that company is, who it's connected to, and where every single dollar you invested in it has gone. I am going to peel back every layer of their financial lives until every dirty secret is exposed to the light. To do that, I need your complete and total authorization. I need access to every bank account, every credit card statement, every tax return you have filed for the past 10 years. I need you to give me the keys to your entire financial kingdom. She stood up and extended her hand across the desk. It was a formal, powerful gesture. A contract. Can you do that for me, Mr. Reed? Can you trust me that much? I looked at her outstretched hand, then back at her determined face. In her, I saw a reflection of the cold resolve that had taken root in my own heart. She wasn't just a lawyer. She was an instrument of justice. The Queen of Justice, as Walt had implied. I stood up and took her hand. Her grip was firm and cool. You have it, I said. Everything, whatever you need. The smile returned to her lips, wider this time. Excellent, she said. Then let's get to work. It's time to find out what Mr. Preston Hayes has been building with your money. Giving Denise Morgan access to my financial life was like handing a master surgeon a scalpel. For the next 2 weeks, her office became the war room. I spent most of my days there not because she needed me, but because I couldn't stand the sterile silence of the hotel room. I watched as she and her team of 2 young, ferociously intelligent paralegals descended into the rabbit hole of my finances. They were financial archaeologists, and they were digging for a monster. They started with Hayes Solutions, LLC. The first few days were a frustrating trawl through public records and corporate registration databases. The company was an onion, and every layer they peeled back revealed another layer of deception. It was registered to a P.O. box in Delaware, a state notorious for its corporate secrecy. The listed agent was another anonymous LLC. It was a ghost designed to be untraceable. He's not an amateur, Denise said to me one afternoon, her brow furrowed in concentration as she stared at her monitor. He's read a book or two. He knows how to create shell corporations to hide his tracks. But the problem with ghosts is that they still have to touch the real world somewhere. They still have to spend money. And that was where they found the first thread. Using the bank transfer records from my account, they were able to subpoena the bank records for Hayes Solutions. When the records finally came through, they weren't a ledger of business transactions. They were a diary of my son-in-law's greed. The money I thought was a small investment was being funneled out almost as soon as it came in. There were payments to Preston's personal credit cards, cash withdrawals from ATMs near high-end golf courses, and transfers to online investment accounts under his name. There was no business. There were no solutions. The company was nothing more than a private pipeline built for the sole purpose of draining my retirement savings directly into his pocket. It was a meticulous, calculated theft that had been going on for over 2 years. But the true gut punch came a few days later. One of the paralegals, a sharp young woman named Maria, called Denise over to her desk, her voice low and urgent. "You need to see this, Denise," she said. "I ran a full credit report on Mr. Reed." Denise motioned for me to come over. On the screen was my credit report. I saw my name, my social security number, my address. But the numbers the accounts listed below, they were a nightmare. There were credit cards I'd never heard of, from banks I'd never done business with, all with balances maxed out to their limits. There was a car loan for a luxury sedan I had never seen. And worst of all, there was a home equity line of credit, a second mortgage taken out against my house. The house Gloria and I had paid off celebrated burning the mortgage papers for 20 years ago. It was no longer truly mine. I felt the blood drain from my face. "How is this possible?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. "I didn't sign anything." "You didn't have to," Denise said, her voice a low, controlled fury. "He had your social security number, your date of birth, all of your personal information. He lived in your house. He probably intercepted your mail. He had everything he needed to apply for these accounts online in your name. He used your pristine credit, the credit of a man who paid every bill on time for 50 years, as his personal piggy bank." I thought of all those years. The careful budgeting. The overtime shifts, the small sacrifices Gloria and I made to ensure we had a secure future. I remembered my first credit card from a department store with a $300 limit. I treated it with a kind of reverence. Paying that bill on time every month wasn't just about money. It was a matter of honor, a brick in the foundation of a man's good name. And Preston. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had taken my name, my 50 years of hard-won integrity, and dragged it through the mud. He had systematically destroyed my financial identity, leaving a trail of debt and ruin that would have taken me the rest of my life to clean up. It was a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical violation, like he had reached into my chest and stolen a part of my soul. The weight of it all was crushing. For a moment I felt the rage falter, replaced by a wave of pure, helpless despair. This was bigger than I thought. The hole was deeper. Maybe it was too deep. Denise must have seen it in my eyes. She placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "This is not a setback, Isaiah," she said, her voice cutting through the fog of my despair. "This is ammunition. This is no longer just a case of a son-in-law taking advantage of his father-in-law. This is felony identity theft. This is wire fraud. He didn't just break your trust. He broke federal laws. He's gotten sloppy. He's gotten greedy. And greedy men leave tracks." She was right. The despair receded and the cold resolve returned harder than before. We now had the weapons. We had the proof of his smaller crimes, but we were still missing the motive for the biggest crime of all. Why the desperate act on the subway platform? Why the sudden need to get rid of me so violently? The answer came late the following week. It was Maria, the young paralegal, who found it. She had been cross-referencing Preston's known associates with public property records, a tedious, mind-numbing task. Suddenly she sat bolt upright in her chair. "Holy!" She breathed, her eyes wide. "Denise, I found it." Denise and I rushed over. On her screen was a series of property deeds and city planning documents. It was a complicated web of transactions with properties being bought and sold through shell corporations. But at the center of it all was one key asset, a derelict half-acre plot of industrial land in a forgotten corner of Queens right by the Sunnyside rail yards. The final purchase had been made through a company directly linked to Preston just 3 weeks ago. Why this piece of junk land? Denise mused aloud, zooming in on a satellite map. There's nothing there but a crumbling warehouse. She pulled up another file, a recently published city infrastructure proposal. And there it was. Phase 2 of the Long Island Railroad East Side Access Project. A new tunnel entrance was being planned, a new service junction. And it was slated to be built directly adjacent to that derelict plot of land. Preston wasn't buying junk land, he was buying a gold mine. He must have gotten an inside tip. He used my $20,000 cash advance and the money from the fraudulent loans to secure this purchase, I said, connecting the dots. If the city project goes through, they'll have to buy him out. He stands to make millions, and a sudden inheritance from his father-in-law would have given him the liquid capital to develop it even further before the city came knocking. Denise added, her eyes gleaming with understanding. That's the motive. That's why he got desperate when you cut him off. It all made sense. But as I stared at the map, at the overlay of the proposed new tunnel, a cold dread completely separate from my anger began to creep up my spine. My 40 years in the tunnels had given me a kind of sixth sense for the city's underground geography. I knew where the old water mains were, where the bedrock was solid and where it was soft. And I knew this area. I had driven trains through the existing tunnels under that land 1,000 times. "Denise," I said slowly, my finger tracing a line on the screen. "Something's not right here." "What do you mean, this location?" I said, a sick feeling growing in my stomach. "The new junction they're proposing. It's too close to the old 63rd Street tunnel. That's one of the oldest and most sensitive sections of the whole system. There have been issues with water seepage there for decades. To do major construction there, it's not just difficult, it's monumentally stupid. It's dangerous." Denise frowned. Maybe the city engineers know what they're doing. Or maybe I countered, a new terrible suspicion beginning to form in my mind. Preston knows something they don't. Or something he's not telling his partners. This isn't just about buying land and waiting. There's something else going on here. There's a piece of this puzzle we're missing. I looked at the map at the intersection of tunnels and property lines. My world and his were colliding in a way I never could have imagined. This was no longer just about my money or my house. This was about my city. My tunnels. "I need to make a call," I said, my voice grim. "I need to talk to Walt. He can get me access to the MTA's internal engineering schematics. The old ones. The ones that show what's really under that piece of land." Denise looked at me, her eyes sharp. She knew we were standing on the edge of a much bigger discovery. We had found his motive. Now it was time to find his endgame. And I had a terrible feeling that it was going to be far worse than anything we had imagined. While Denise and her team were digging into the financial labyrinth Preston had created, she advised a simple, brutal first move. We didn't need to wait for the full picture of his fraud to be complete. We already had the most basic tool of all: the deed to my house. It was in my name and my name alone. The first rule of battle, Denise had said, her voice sharp as glass, is to control the terrain. That house is your terrain. It's time to remind them of that. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived at my home in Queens. I wasn't there to see it, of course. I was in my hotel room, which had started to feel more like a command center than a place of refuge. I pictured the scene in my mind: the mail carrier handing the envelope to Alicia, her confused expression as she signed for it, the way her hands would tremble as she read the legal jargon inside. The document was a formal ironclad eviction notice. It gave the current occupants, Preston Hayes and Alicia Reed, 30 days to vacate the premises. It was cold, impersonal, and absolutely undeniable. It was the first shot fired in a war they didn't even know had been declared. I didn't have to wait long. My phone rang just after noon. The caller ID showed Alicia's number. I let it ring 3 times before answering, taking a slow, steadying breath. "Hello, Alicia," I said, my voice calm. Her voice, on the other hand, was a high-pitched torrent of panic and disbelief. "Daddy, what is this? What is this letter? It's a joke, right? This has to be some kind of horrible mistake." "There's no mistake, Alicia," I replied, keeping my tone level. "It is exactly what it looks like. An eviction notice." She shrieked the word, sounding alien in her mouth. "You're evicting us, your own daughter, from our home." "It is my home, Alicia," I said, and the words were like stones, heavy and hard. "It has always been my home. You were guests, and your visit is now over, but why?" she sobbed, the pathetic, predictable tears starting to flow, the tears that had worked on me for so many years. "After everything we've been through, I don't understand. How could you be so cruel?" I felt nothing. The well of sympathy she had drawn from for decades had run dry. It had all been spilled onto the tracks of the 74th Street station. "You want to talk about cruelty?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "Let's talk about standing on a subway platform and smiling while you watch your father get run over by a train. Let's start there." The sobbing on the other end of the line stopped, abruptly replaced by a choked, gasping sound. She had no answer for that. The truth was, a weapon she had no defense against. Then I heard a scuffling sound, and a man's voice, angry and loud, in the background. "Give me the phone," Preston shouted. The next voice I heard was his, dripping with arrogance and rage. "You old fool," he snarled, dispensing with any pretense of respect. "What do you think you're doing? You think a piece of paper is going to scare me? This is our house. We live here. There are laws, tenants' rights." "You are not tenants, Preston," I said, my voice as cold as the steel rails. "You paid no rent. You have no lease. You are occupants, and your permission to occupy the premises has been revoked. You have 30 days. He laughed, a short, ugly barking sound. "You've really lost it, haven't you? You can't win this. I'll get a lawyer. I'll drag this out in court for years. You'll be broke before you ever get us out of this house." His anger was predictable. His threats were hollow. He was a bully who had just been punched in the mouth for the first time, and he didn't know how to react except by puffing out his chest and making more noise. He still thought he was in control. He still thought I was the same weak old man he could manipulate and intimidate. "That's your choice, Preston," I said calmly. "But I should tell you my lawyer is very much looking forward to the discovery process. She has a lot of questions about a certain company. I believe it's called Hayes Solutions." The silence that followed was more satisfying than any shouting match could ever be. I had hit him where he lived, not in my house, but in his web of secrets and lies. He was sputtering, trying to form a response, a threat, anything. But I didn't give him the chance. 30 days, Preston," I said, cutting him off. "The clock is ticking." And I hung up. I placed the phone down on the nightstand. My hand was perfectly steady. There was no fear, no doubt, no regret. I didn't feel joy. This wasn't about happiness. It was about balance. For years, the scales of justice in my life had been tipped so far in their favor that I had forgotten what equilibrium felt like. Now I had just placed the first weight on my side of the scale. It was a small weight, just a single piece of paper, but it was enough to make the entire structure of their world begin to groan. And I was just getting started. The eviction notice was just the opening salvo, the loud crack of a sniper rifle to let the enemy know they were in our sights. The main assault, the one designed to cripple their entire operation, came a week later. Armed with the mountain of evidence her team had uncovered, the fraudulent credit applications, the second mortgage on my house, the intricate web of transfers into Hayes Solutions, LLC. Denise filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit against Preston Hayes. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal devastation. It listed counts of fraud, identity theft, and unjust enrichment. But the most brilliant part was the motion she filed along with it. It was an emergency ex parte motion for a temporary asset freeze. She argued compellingly that Preston was a flight risk, and that if alerted, he would immediately move to hide or dissipate the very assets we were suing to recover. The judge agreed. In a closed session without Preston or his lawyers present, the judge signed the order. With the stroke of a pen, a financial iron curtain descended around my son-in-law. Every known bank account, every credit card, every investment vehicle linked to his name or his shell companies was instantly frozen solid. Denise learned from a source that Preston was scheduled to host a high-stakes luncheon that very day. He was meeting with a group of private equity investors, the money men he was courting to fund his grand vision for the Sunnyside rail yards. It was the biggest meeting of his professional life. Denise timed the execution of the court order to coincide with it perfectly. I imagined the scene. Preston at the head of a long table in a private dining room of an obscenely expensive Manhattan restaurant. He'd be in his element, oozing charisma, painting a picture of guaranteed profits and a future built on his genius. The investors, older, wealthier, and more ruthless men, would be listening, their faces impassive, calculating the risk. The meal would be coming to an end. The talk would be done. Preston, in a gesture of magnanimous confidence, would reach for the bill. "Gentlemen," he would say with a broad, practiced smile. "Lunch is on me, of course." He would slide his platinum credit card, his symbol of success, across the table to the waiter. And then the quiet humiliation. The waiter returning to the table, a look of deep discomfort on his face. "I'm very sorry, sir," he would whisper, leaning in close. "This card has been declined." Preston's smile would falter, a flicker of annoyance. He'd laugh it off. "Must be a mistake. A security flag. Try this one." He'd hand over another card, a black one this time. The waiter would retreat. The investors would watch, their impassive masks still in place, but their eyes missing nothing. The waiter would return again, his expression even more pained. "I'm sorry, sir. This one as well." The annoyance would now curdle into confusion. Preston would excuse himself from the table, his confident swagger gone, replaced by a tense, hurried walk. In the lobby, he would pull out his phone to call the bank, his voice a low, angry hiss, and he would be told the news. Not that there was a fraud alert, not that he had exceeded his limit, but that his accounts were frozen. All of them. By court order. His world would collapse in the hushed marble lobby of a 3-Michelin-star restaurant. The investors, seeing him return to the table, his face pale and beaded with sweat, would know instantly that the deal was dead. They wouldn't need an explanation. They were sharks. They could smell blood in the water from a mile away. They would make their polite excuses and leave their footsteps echoing the death of his ambitions. That's when my phone would ring. His rage was a physical force so powerful I could almost feel it through the phone. He didn't even say hello. "You!" he screamed, his voice hoarse with fury. "You did this! You senile old bastard! What did you do?" I said. "Nothing. I simply passed the phone to Denise, who was sitting opposite me in her office." She took it, her expression calm and cool. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice a detached professional monotone. "This is Denise Morgan. I am counsel for Isaiah Reed. From this point forward, all communication regarding this matter must be directed through my office. Do you understand?" I could hear him sputtering a string of curses and threats. Denise listened patiently, holding the phone slightly away from her ear. When he finally paused to take a breath, she spoke again. "We have no further comment at this time, Mr. Hayes. I would strongly advise you to retain legal counsel. Have a pleasant afternoon." And she ended the call. That we knew would push him over the edge. A man like Preston, a narcissist obsessed with control and image, could not handle being publicly humiliated and then dismissed so coolly. He had been rendered powerless, and it would drive him insane. He would do something stupid, something reckless. And he did. Later that evening, Denise received an automated alert from one of the financial tracking services she used. At 6:47 p.m., a large wire transfer had been attempted from a numbered account in the Cayman Islands to an account in Dubai. The Cayman account was held by a shell corporation that was after 3 layers of corporate veiling, ultimately owned by Preston Hayes. It was his secret escape hatch, the money he had successfully hidden offshore. The transfer was for over $200,000. But because the originating owner, Preston Hayes, was now on a financial watch list, thanks to the judge's order, the transfer was automatically flagged and blocked by the international banking system. Denise leaned back in her chair, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across her face. "And there it is," she said, her voice a purr of victory. "The mistake." She explained it to me. By attempting to move that money, Preston had done two things that were a gift to our case. First, he had proven that he was in fact a flight risk with hidden assets, completely justifying the emergency freeze and making it all but certain that the judge would keep it in place indefinitely. Second, and far more importantly, he had just created a clear, undeniable link between himself and an offshore account. He had just admitted through his actions that he had something to hide. It was like a suspect fleeing from the scene of a crime. It wasn't proof of the crime itself, but it was a powerful indicator of guilt. "He just handed the IRS and the FBI a signed confession," Denise said, her eyes gleaming. "He thinks he's fighting a lawsuit with an old man. He doesn't realize he just picked a fight with the entire federal government." The eviction notice had made him angry. This had made him desperate. And a desperate Preston Hayes, we were quickly learning, was his own worst enemy. The noose was tightening, and he was the one pulling the rope. The call from Walt came just after dawn. I had been up all night staring at the city maps on my laptop. The image of that derelict plot of land burned into my mind. I knew there was something wrong with it, something Preston was counting on. Walt's voice on the phone confirmed my deepest fears. It wasn't angry like before. It was quiet, spooked. It was the voice of a man who has stared into the abyss. "Isaiah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I went down to the archives. The real archives. The paper ones they keep in a climate-controlled vault under the MTA headquarters. I pulled the original schematics and geological surveys for the 63rd Street tunnel extension from the 70s. He took a breath. "You were right. It's worse than we thought. The ground in that specific area right under Preston's property is unstable. There are a series of old engineering reports that flagged it as a high-risk subsidence zone. They talk about a compromised section of bedrock and persistent water seepage from an underground stream they had to divert. The official recommendation was that the surface level directly above it should never be subjected to heavy construction or deep excavation." My blood ran cold. "So he bought a piece of land he can't even build on." "That's just it," Isaiah, Walt said, his voice dropping even lower. "He doesn't want to build. He wants to demolish." I found one last thing buried in a box of inter-office memos from 1978. It's from a senior engineer who was about to retire. He was furious. He wrote that the city council at the time, to save money, had overruled the engineers and approved a cheaper, less extensive reinforcement for that specific 100-yard section of the tunnel wall. He called it a catastrophic failure waiting for a catalyst. He warned that any significant surface-level shock or vibration could over time lead to a structural collapse. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, and the image they formed was monstrous. I finally understood. Preston's plan wasn't just to wait for the city to buy his land. That would take years, and the payout wouldn't be big enough for his greed. His plan was to create the catalyst himself. He would start some minor excavation on his property for a new foundation, something that would look legitimate on paper. But he would know, thanks to his inside source at the planning department, that this minor work would be just enough to shake that fragile 70-year-old tunnel. He wasn't planning to build a skyscraper. He was planning to trigger a controlled disaster. It would start with cracks, then a major leak. The MTA would have to shut down the line for emergency inspections. The land above would be declared critically unstable. The city, faced with a public safety crisis and the prospect of a catastrophic collapse that could kill hundreds, would have no choice. They would have to seize his property through eminent domain and buy him out immediately at a massively inflated emergency price so they could begin reinforcement work. He wasn't just committing fraud. He was holding the city hostage, using the lives of thousands of commuters as his bargaining chip. I brought the information to Denise. I laid out the old engineering memo, the maps, the terrifying logic of it all. She listened, her face a mask of stone. When I was finished, she didn't look shocked. She looked like a general who had just been handed the enemy's secret battle plans. The cold, analytical calm was gone, replaced by a righteous, terrifying fury. "This changes everything," she said, her voice a low growl. "This is no longer a civil case about money. This is a public menace. This is attempted mass endangerment. We're done playing defense. We're done chipping away at his finances. We're ending this. Now." She stood up and began to pace her office, not with agitation, but with the focused energy of a predator about to strike. "We are not going to add this to our lawsuit," she declared. "We are going to take this entire package, the identity theft, the offshore accounts, the systematic fraud, and now this plot to break your city's backbone, and we are going to deliver it. We will not give him the courtesy of a legal battle. We will subject him to a public execution." She went to her desk and made 2 phone calls. Her voice was calm, but the words were lethal. The first call was to a senior prosecutor in the Queens District Attorney's office, a man she had clearly worked with before. "John," she said, "I have a case for you that is going to make your career. It involves real estate fraud, offshore accounts, and a plot to destabilize the New York City subway system. I'm sending the entire file over in 1 hour. You're going to want to see this before anyone else does." She hung up before he could respond. Her second call was to a number she knew by heart. "Sarah," she said, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more familiar but no less intense. "It's Denise. Do you trust me?" "Good. I am about to give you the biggest story of your year. It's got everything. Greed, betrayal, and a villain who makes the robber barons of the last century look like petty thieves. I need you to break it on the front page of the Times tomorrow morning. I'm giving you the exclusive. The DA is getting the file at the same time. You'll have all the confirmation you need." The next morning, the bomb went off. I sat in my hotel room, the television on the New York Times spread out on the bed. The headline was stripped across the top of the front page in huge bold letters. "Developers land grab included plot to destabilize subway tunnel, DA sources say." It was an inferno. The story was the lead on every local news channel. They ran frightening 3D animations showing the old tunnel and the potential for a horrific collapse under a packed rush-hour train. They interviewed stunned city officials and terrified union leaders. My son-in-law, Preston Hayes, was no longer just a name in a lawsuit. He was the most hated man in New York City. His smug professional headshot was plastered on every screen next to diagrams of death and destruction. Alicia's face was right there beside his, the complicit wife. The narrative was simple and damning, the greedy, soulless couple willing to risk a catastrophe for a payday. The city was in an uproar. Politicians demanded immediate investigations. The MTA launched an emergency inspection of the tunnel. Preston and Alicia were trapped in my house, a prison surrounded by a sea of news vans and angry reporters. And then at the absolute peak of the public fury, Denise delivered the killing blow. She took the thumb drive with the video from the subway platform and sent it anonymously to a popular online news blog known for its viral content. By noon, it was everywhere. The headline was "Brutal Watch Couple Accused in Tunnel Plot Smile After Pushing Elderly Father Onto Subway Tracks." The video was the final, unforgivable piece of the puzzle. It connected their abstract public crime to an act of intimate personal evil that everyone could understand. It showed the world who they truly were. They weren't just greedy, they were monsters. The smiles on their faces as they looked down at the tracks where I should have been dying became the defining image of the entire scandal. It was the proof of their character, the window into their black souls. There was no defense against it. There was no explanation. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was instantaneous, unanimous, and absolute. Guilty. Their lives, the ones they had built on my money, and their lies were over. And the whole world was watching them burn. The public firestorm was so intense that the legal process moved with astonishing speed. Preston Hayes was arrested less than 48 hours after the story broke. He was denied bail, deemed a flight risk, and a danger to the community. He was sent to Rikers Island to await trial. The media circus was relentless, but Denise shielded me from all of it. I watched the downfall from the quiet anonymity of my hotel room, a ghost observing the destruction he had set in motion. The trial itself was a formality. The district attorney's office had a mountain of evidence that was simply irrefutable. The financial records were a clear roadmap of his fraud. The MTA engineering reports proved the malice and recklessness of his tunnel plot. His own panicked attempt to move his offshore money was a confession in black and white. Faced with a life sentence, Preston's high-priced lawyers tried to argue that he was a brilliant but misunderstood entrepreneur, a visionary who took risks that went too far. They painted a picture of a man driven by ambition, not malice. But then the prosecution played their final card. They put the video of the subway platform on a giant screen in the courtroom. They played it in slow motion, zooming in on the smug, satisfied smiles on Preston's and Alicia's faces as they looked down at the empty tracks. The courtroom fell silent. You could feel the air turn to ice. That single image destroyed any shred of sympathy, any possibility of reasonable doubt. It was the final, brutal truth. Alicia never went to trial. In the end, her weakness saved her. Faced with the evidence and the prospect of a long prison sentence as an accomplice, she broke. She turned on Preston, completely agreeing to testify against him in exchange for a plea deal. She told the prosecutors everything about his manipulations, his contempt for me, his cold admission after the fact that he was disappointed I had survived. Her testimony was the final nail in his coffin. Preston was found guilty on all major counts: conspiracy to commit reckless endangerment, grand larceny, wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. The judge in his sentencing called him a man of profound moral depravity and a cancer on the community. He was sentenced to 25 to 30 years in a maximum security state prison. He would be an old man, older than I am now, before he would ever have a chance at parole. Alicia, for her cooperation, received 5 years of probation and was ordered to perform 2,000 hours of community service. She lost everything, of course. Her reputation was in tatters. She was a social pariah. But she avoided a prison cell. That was her reward for betraying the man she had once betrayed me for. I did not attend a single day of the trial. I didn't need to. My victory wasn't in seeing him in chains. My victory was in knowing the truth was finally out. On a cold, clear afternoon in November, a month after the eviction notice had expired, I finally went home. Denise had arranged for a locksmith to meet me there. The horde of reporters was long gone, having moved on to the next scandal. The street was quiet, just as I remembered it. As the locksmith worked on the front door, I stood on the sidewalk just looking at the house. It was just a simple brick house in Queens, but it was the only real home I had ever known. It was where Gloria and I had raised our daughter, where we had weathered storms and celebrated birthdays. It was the repository of my entire life. For the last few years, it had felt like an occupied territory. Now it was about to be liberated. The locksmith finished handing me a new set of keys. "It's all yours again, sir," he said. I nodded, thanked him, and waited for him to drive away. I wanted to do this alone. I put the new key in the lock. It turned smoothly. The door swung open into silence. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The house was empty. Not just of people, but of things. They had taken all their expensive furniture, their designer clothes, their entire life of curated luxury. All that was left was what had been there before them. My old armchair, the sturdy oak dining table, the bookshelf Gloria had filled with her favorite novels. The air was stale, holding the faint ghostly scent of Alicia's perfume. I walked from room to room. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the empty spaces where their lives used to be. I saw the scuff marks on the wall where their oversized sofa had been, the faint outline on the carpet where their bed had stood. They were like ghosts, but they had no power here anymore. I didn't feel a rush of triumph. I didn't pump my fist in the air. The feeling was much quieter, much deeper than that. It was a profound, bone-deep sense of peace. A heavy-weighted peace. It was the feeling of a soldier returning from a long, brutal war. The fighting was over. The enemy was defeated. And I had survived. I had come home. I ran my hand over the oak dining table. The table where Preston had handed me those credit card bills, where he had smirked and called me old. It was just a table again now. Its power to intimidate was gone. I walked into the living room and sat down in my old armchair. The worn fabric felt like a familiar embrace. The silence in the house was different now. It was no longer the tense, suffocating silence of unspoken resentments. It was a clean, peaceful silence, the silence of solitude, not of loneliness. My eyes fell upon the mantelpiece above the fireplace, and I smiled a real smile for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Amidst the dust and emptiness, one thing remained. It was a simple silver-plated frame. Inside it was a photograph of Gloria and me taken on our 25th wedding anniversary. We were standing in the backyard, the old maple tree in full autumn color behind us. We were laughing. I walked over and picked it up, wiping the dust from the glass with my thumb. I looked at my wife's beautiful, smiling face. "We did it, Gloria," I whispered to the empty room. "I protected it. I protected our home." In that moment, I knew the war was truly over. He had tried to take my money, my home, my name. He had even tried to take my life. but he had failed to take the one thing that truly mattered, my dignity. I had walked through the fire and emerged not unscathed but whole. I placed the photograph back in the center of the mantelpiece, the one true treasure in a house that was finally mine again. And for the first time in years, the house felt like home. I spent the first few days in my reclaimed home just being. I sat in my armchair and listened to the silence. I made myself coffee in my own kitchen. I slept in my own bed. Each simple act was a quiet declaration of victory. I was a king who had returned to a very small, very quiet kingdom. On the third day, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a delivery. It wasn't a neighbor. I knew with a certainty that felt as solid as the foundation of the house who was on the other side of that door. I walked to the door, my footsteps echoing slightly in the empty hallway. There was no anger in my heart, no fear, only a quiet final sense of resolution. This was the last piece of business. I opened the door. It was Alicia. The woman standing on my porch was a stranger. The expensive, perfectly styled blonde hair was gone, replaced by her natural dark hair pulled back in a simple, messy ponytail. The designer clothes had been replaced by a plain gray sweatshirt and jeans that hung loosely on her thin frame. Her face was pale and drawn without a trace of makeup, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of countless sleepless nights. The arrogance, the entitlement, the casual cruelty. It had all been stripped away. All that was left was a hollowed-out shell. She looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of a life she had helped to burn down. She flinched slightly when she saw me, as if she had expected me to slam the door in her face. When I simply stood there waiting, she seemed to shrink into herself. "Daddy," she said, her voice a fragile, broken whisper. It was the first time she had called me that in a long time. It used to be a term of endearment. Now it was a plea. I just nodded, my face impassive. Tears welled in her eyes, real tears this time, born of desperation, not of manipulation. "I'm sorry," she choked out the words, stumbling over each other. "I am so sorry. I was so stupid. I was so weak. Preston, he promised me everything. He had this way of making you believe that the whole world could be yours, and I was so tired of everything. I was so blind." She was looking for a reaction, for a sign of the old man, the father who would hug her and tell her everything would be all right. I remembered a time when those two words, "I'm sorry," from her could fix anything. A broken vase, a failed test, a teenage lie, healed with a hug and a promise to do better. But some things once broken can never be put back together again. The chasm between us now was too wide, too deep. It had been blasted into existence by an act of profound betrayal. "An apology can't fix a broken rail, Alicia," I said, and my voice was quiet, but it was not kind. It was simply the voice of truth. She looked confused, her tear-filled eyes searching my face for a meaning she didn't want to find. "You weren't just blind, Alicia." I continued spelling it out for her, for both of us. "You chose to close your eyes. Weakness is letting someone convince you to do something wrong. What you did was different. You were an active participant. When he put his hand on my back, you put your hand on my arm. When he pushed me, you chose to let go. And when you stood on that platform looking down at where I was supposed to be dying, you chose to smile. Each word was a careful, deliberate stone laid one on top of the other, building a wall between us that could never be torn down." She began to sob openly now, her shoulders shaking, but it had no effect on me. I was immune to her tears. "I know," she cried. "I know, and I will live with that for the rest of my life. But please, Daddy, I have nothing. I have nowhere to go. I'm your daughter." "Yes," I said. "You are my daughter, and I am the father you left for dead. That is the truth of our relationship now. It is the only truth that matters." I reached into my pocket and took out my wallet. Not to give her money, but I took out a small folded piece of paper. It was a list of homeless shelters and job placement centers in the city that Denise's office had prepared for me. I held it out to her. "This is all I have for you," I said. "It is more than you gave me. It is a chance to start over, a real start, on your own." She stared at the piece of paper in my hand as if it were a snake. Taking it would be an admission that the old life, the life of being taken care of, was truly over. After a long moment, her trembling hand reached out and took it. Her fingers were ice cold. "Your choices have consequences, Alicia." I said, my voice softening just a fraction, not with forgiveness, but with a sad finality. "This is your consequence. You wanted a life without me in it. Now you have it." And with that, I stepped back into my house. I didn't slam the door. There was no anger left for that. I simply closed it gently, but firmly. The click of the new lock sliding into place was a quiet, definitive sound. It was the sound of a chapter ending, the sound of a past being sealed away forever. Through the peephole, I watched her stand on the porch for a long time, just staring at the piece of paper in her hand. Then she turned, and the ghost of my daughter walked away down the street alone until she was out of sight. I did not feel joy. I did not feel sadness. I felt nothing. Just the clean, cold peace of a debt, finally and fully paid. I don't go down into the subway much anymore. My work down there is done. But sometimes in the early morning, I take my coffee and sit on a park bench in my neighborhood, the one that overlooks the elevated tracks of the 7 train. I watch the first train of the day rumble past its windows, glowing with light, carrying the city's dreamers and workers towards the rising sun. It's a peaceful sound to me now, a familiar rhythm. I am not the same man who was pushed from that platform. That man was a father, a grandfather, a trusting old fool. He died down there in the dirt and the darkness. The man who climbed out is someone else. I am not a victim. I am a survivor. But more than that, I am a testament to a simple, powerful truth they never understood. Preston and Alicia looked at me and saw a relic. An old man who told boring stories about a job they couldn't comprehend. They saw my 40 years of service, not as a source of pride or knowledge, but as a symbol of a small, insignificant life. They thought my world, the world of tunnels and third rails and timetables, was a dark, dirty place to be forgotten. They tried to make it my tomb. What they never realized was that my knowledge of that world was the only weapon I needed. They came at me with lawyers and lies, with financial tricks and brute force. I fought back with engineering schematics from 1978. I fought back with an understanding of ballast stones and drainage troughs. I used the very foundation of the city they tried to exploit, the city I spent my life serving, to bring their world of greed crashing down around them. They pushed me onto the tracks to steal a house and some money. They had no idea that for 40 years working in the dark, I had learned a fundamental lesson. The strongest foundations aren't built with brick and mortar or with stocks and bonds. They are built with truth. They are built with dignity. And that is a foundation that no one, no matter how clever or cruel, can ever demolish. Their lives became the nightmare they had planned for me, a prison of consequences, legal fees, and public shame. And me. As I sit here watching the sun climb higher in the sky, feeling its warmth on my face, I finally understand what Gloria always knew. For the first time in a long, long time, I am at peace, and I am going to have a very good night's sleep. If this ordeal has taught me anything, it's that society often measures a person's value by their wealth or their youth. My son-in-law saw me as an obstacle, a resource to be cashed in. He never imagined that the knowledge I gained over 40 years in the tunnels, the very world he dismissed, was a more potent weapon than all his fraudulent money. This taught me that true strength isn't about the power you can buy, but about the dignity you refuse to sell and the wisdom that a lifetime of quiet, honest work can build. Let me know in the comments about a time you had to fight for your own dignity against those who should have protected it most.